You already know. You already know. What to do, what to do. What to do, what to do. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Yo, is we live? Oh, we here. A minute. Yeah, we're live. Ah, shoot. Bruh. My goodness. Mic's on. Oh my goodness. Mic's on. Oh my goodness. Mic's on. Oh my goodness. Alrighty, so you see the title, y'all see the title, Mr. Ballen. That's what we're going to be reacting to. You know what I'm saying? For react to some Mr. Ballen. You know what I'm saying? Make sure you guys go to the chat.
To the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal his phone and change the names of all their contacts to just say
Yo, like through. Yo, he must have a huge for him to not even like that much.
Today's stories.
Alright. Oh, chat. I'm finna change my.
On January 17th, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run and not go inside of this factory. But Gary was not about to run. He'd been waiting for months for this, and he was ready. So Gary, along with the guards at his sides, made their way towards the factory, and then without any hesitation, Gary stepped inside. And what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it, nothing. It was just basically this massive empty space and one chair pushed up against the far back wall. Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair. So without even being told, he just began walking across the floor towards it. And then when he reached the chair, he sat down. And once Gary was sitting, the guards that had walked him in began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair so he couldn't move. And as they did this, Gary didn't put up a fight. He just sat there staring straight across to the other side.
I feel like that's the scariest. That's the scariest motherfucker, because it's like, obviously he's talking about death row. He's talking about he said, but basically it's like it's I wonder do murderers really go to hell? Do murderers really go to hell? Or they if they sincerely repent, if they sincerely repent, do they do they go to heaven?
Straight across to the other side of this factory. And on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of this space. It was like this big curtain, like somebody had wheeled out like this massive curtain that was protecting something on the other side. And as he was staring at this curtain that was protecting something on the other side, and as he was staring at this curtain that was sort of perpendicular to him, he saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain. And even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of this, they were the So Gary was a convicted murderer.
Yeah.
And he had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. His death sentence had gotten a lot of media coverage, and immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But while Gary appreciated their efforts, he He actually did not want that. He did not want, to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was the only alternative to the death sentence, is life without parole. And that sounded horrible. And so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution, and he was very specific about how he wanted to die. He wanted to die by firing squad, and that had been granted to him. And so after the guards had finished strapping Gary into the chair, they backed off, and then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready, and then once everything was in place, rifles poked through the 5 holes in the curtain, and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client with a lot of promise, who was hopefully looking to expand, and they were leaning on Dan. And while Dan certainly believed that this company had the change, he just felt like he lacked something. He needed a strong marketing campaign to make them a household name. And so this happening right now with his colleagues was their attempts at coming up with, what can we do? What campaign can we run for? Out there pitching different ideas, how we can elevate. But it was like, even though a lot of ideas seemed promising, nothing really felt right. Everything just sort of felt like, maybe that would help. There was no slam dunk idea, at least not yet. Dan was beginning to get frustrated, realizing he didn't have any great ideas yet. He suddenly has this epiphany. Now, Dan does not understand why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about this information until it just popped into his head. Instead, this idea really just kind of suddenly came to him. As he's sitting there with his colleagues, feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do, he just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. And as Dan is sitting there just thinking about that execution, he remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore.
Wait a minute, hold on. I don't think. Wait, so you're saying that Dan, this nigga Dan, is thinking about how he can market this? What? Wait a minute.
Remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan.
Well, wait, hold on. I don't think I catch it right.
As he's sitting there, understand why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about what kind of campaign can we run and sort of make a household name. And so,
wait a minute. Okay, so he said they tried to make him a household name.
That Dan was having ideas, maybe that would help. There was why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about this information until it just popped into his head. Instead, this idea really just kind of suddenly came to him. As he's sitting there with his colleagues, feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do, he just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. And as Dan is sitting there just thinking about that execution, he remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business. And it would work amazingly. In fact, this campaign was so successful, it literally doubled this company's business practically overnight. And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world. The slogan that Dan created as part of this very famous campaign was based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words. Just do it. Dan's client, that small business, last year we launched a brand new podcast. And so far,
wait a minute.
Based Gary Gilmore words. Client that was
Gosh.
last year we launched a brand new podcast.
Y'all, as a part, I'm not a flashy ass motherfucker. So, I really don't, I'm not big on the newest Nike, but but I've always wondered, what was the, motivational speech? Would you like that, we want to do that where I'll never
Here
look
at
at
Ballen
Nike the
Studios.
same. Where I'll
Here
never
at
look at
Ballen
Nike the
Studios
same.
called Redacted: Declassified Mysteries with Luke Lamana.
That's
And
crazy.
so far, you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted, where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers, and it's growing really quickly. Hours of content available right now for you to. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up @Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wondery Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wondery app. Okay, back to the stories.
That's crazy.
One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris could afford. In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do, and so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, "Is this okay?" And she kind of looked back and smiled like, "I get it, it's fine, we can eat here." So they hopped in line and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped him, walked over, and Chris very polite, "Here too, we won't bother you. We're gonna get out of here." And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, "Sure, go ahead." And so Chris sat down, chatted. But as they were chatting, Chris, he had that big job interview the next morning.
Yeah.
And it was just really the only thing he could think about. In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't. And so he found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food, and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date. Looking at the date does not seem friendly.
Hold on. Hey, hold on now. Hold on now. First of all,
and so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something? And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview, and he looks at this guy and he's like, "What's going on?" Because again, this guy's just staring at his date. And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date, insulting the way she looked, insulting the way she talked. And Chris is like, "What's going on here?" He's looking.
Hey, know what's going on, bro? Get up and confront him like, "Yo, who the f is you talking to? You ain't talking to my woman like that." Now I understand. Hell no.
Looking at his date like, did I miss something? Remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago. But then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, "You're an ugly pig." And at this, Chris is like, "I can't just sit here."
No.
And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, "Hey man, get up." Like he's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake because Chris, he was only about 5'8" and just
size don't matter in a fight. Size don't matter in a fight. Size do not matter in a fight. or something. You either got power or you don't.
Tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature. And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris. But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor.
For real.
And he kind of looks up at this guy, and he just kind of winds up and hits him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his riot, and Chris was super at this point. He kept apologizing to his date, and she's like, no, it's fine. And they just wanted to get out of there, and so they left the McDonald's, and they both, went to their respective homes to bed. And then the next morning, when Chris got up early for the interview, looked in the mirror, had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night. There wasn't really a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, you know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I'm just gonna go in there, try to be confident.
You wanna get one shot and not miss your chance.
Don't let the black eye define the outcome. And so fast forward to later that morning, the building interview, and before long he's in his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of like worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good, but it was like the fact that they're staring at it and not it really made him weird. Fast, he got to the interview, viewers thought of him or opportunity, and he left thinking, I'm not going to get the job. However, after this interview, he had gotten the job.
Wow.
And it actually might have been because of his black eye.
What?
Because this job interview was actually in an upcoming TV show. And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights. And so,
wow.
My goodness, he can hit his lines, he's got the charisma, and look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. He's our guy. So Chris got cast, and this TV show that he starred in became one of the most popular TV shows in the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe Awards and Emmy Awards. He truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed his life was the role of Snow in Game of Thrones.
Wow. Wow. I knew it was Game of Thrones when I saw the dragon.
One night in 1925, a 21-year-old college student named Ted was inside of his dorm room at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, surrounded by his friends. Ted and his friends had gotten their hands
not the gin,
sitting around, drinking this gin, and having a great time. Now, Ted and his friends knew this was not allowed. Literally, they knew this was illegal. It didn't matter. At the time in the United States, the country was of prohibition. But Ted specifically was willing to take that risk because tonight he wanted to celebrate. Ted was getting ready to graduate with honors, and also he had recently been named the editor-in-chief of a summer magazine called Lantern. This was a big deal for Ted. He had aspirations of being a professional writer and publisher, falling into place, getting this job as editor-in-chief. It was a huge accomplishment. So Ted took a swig from the bottle and passed it around the circle, and before long, he and his friends were all pretty drunk and having a great time, laughing and joking and telling stories. It was a lot of fun, but at some point, they heard a knock on their door. And right away, Ted and his friends went silent, remembering that, oh my God, are we in trouble now? Ted said, no, it's fine. I'm sure it's just, more friends coming to stop by. He goes to the door and, his heart's racing a little bit because he doesn't know who's there. He opens the door and it's not friends. It's 2 police officers.
Wow.
And so Ted and his friends all got busted for drinking alcohol. However, fortunately for them, the police did not press charges, and so nobody went to jail. And also the school, Dartmouth, decided not to expel Ted or any of his friends. However, they were dealt some pretty severe punishments. Specifically, Dartmouth stripped Ted of all of his academic honors and extracurriculars, which meant he was no longer the editor-in-chief of the Jack-o'-lantern magazine. In fact, he was told by the school that not only was he no longer the editor-in-chief, but he couldn't even submit to put anything in writing into that magazine. He was totally banned. Ted was heartbroken, less so about the academic honors and much more so.
Guess what? Hold on. Let me guess. That's gonna cause him to drink more. That's gonna cause him to drink more. So basically,
about being, cut off from the Jack-o'-lantern magazine. He really had attached a lot of value to being the editor-in-chief. He felt like things were going in the direction of him graduating and becoming this professional writer, and so this was sort of a devastating blow. Ted considered fighting with Dartmouth to try to reinstate himself with the magazine, but the more he thought about it, the more he knew that was going nowhere. They were not going to change their mind. However, Ted was not quite ready to just totally give up on this magazine. He knew this magazine did accept submissions from the public, and so he thought, okay, well, I'm not allowed to submit anything to this magazine, but maybe if I come up with a different name, a pen name, then I can submit my work, they won't know it's me, and maybe I can get something published. And so that's exactly what Ted began doing, and the new editor-in-chief of this magazine had no idea this pen name was actually Ted. And so when they received the work from the pseudonym, they thought it was some new person and they were so wowed by the work. They're like, this is great. And they were publishing all of Ted's work, not realizing it was his. Oddly enough, this became in some ways more satisfying than when he was writing under his own name. He kind of liked this pen name. It kind of, fit the vibe of his writing. And so he just continued up with this route. He was at Dartmouth and then he graduated. Throughout
this goddamn finessing the system.
The rest of his life, Ted would write and illustrate over
60 books, all under this pen name,
a name he came up with basically just because he got caught drinking in the dorm in college. These books would entertain and inspire generations of people, and in fact, he would even win a Pulitzer Prize for his contribution to America. Ted's full name, short pen name.
What?
Yet, our newest graphic novel.
I didn't know that. What's going on? I didn't know that. All right, y'all. We got this. I might hop off stream a little bit and switch to Twitch. Hold on. Okay.
Stories in time. But if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice high-end teeth whitening kit, but don't tell them you've secretly replaced the whitener with red hair dye.
What is your problem? What is your problem with the like button, Mr. Ballen? What is your problem? What the like button do?
Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
Boom. Scenic route.
At 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, 1967, a 17-year-old girl named Nancy McEwen was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn, and she was coming from her home in Long Island, New York. Now, the commute to her office took about an hour, but Nancy didn't mind because her dad had just got her this beautiful brand new yellow Camaro, and she loved driving it. And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below.
Wow.
And so that day, Nancy rolled down
do you know how many days I'll be whipping?
her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove, and then she took in a deep breath and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy, and as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. And as the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly he had some kind of medical emergency because he didn't see any of the car that had been driving completely normally to that point. So like what would cause him to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed? Jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside. Sees this teenage girl, this blonde, and she's slumped over the wheel, and she's not looking, sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, "Are you okay?" And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive. Physical injuries, like clearly into this looking at her, and she's okay up and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking for some clue here. Like for example, and he doesn't see bottles and he can't smell any alcohol. The whole time, the girl's not responding. She's just moaning and just over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up. Responders came over the ambulance and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the medical staff was able to drunk, but she did clearly appear having some kind of emergency. But they didn't know what it was. And there was no visible injuries on her. She looked really shaken up, and after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition was worse to the point where doctors were giving her to try to keep her in work. And hours after she died. Medical staff made a discovery they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was, on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound.
What?
And for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies, and so it made no sense that somebody had just...
That's a lie in itself. Everybody has enemies. Everybody's gonna have somebody that don't like them, that wants them dead, that hates them. Everybody's gonna have enemies. That's a lie. Yeah.
Shot her at.
But hey, yeah.
Shot her at.
But hey, yeah, yeah. R.I.P. to that girl.
She was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree. This was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. I mean, despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, for bullets to see if the bullet struck the driver, but he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots, although admittedly he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he...
Why I feel like the police did it. Why I feel like the police did it. You see, I've been watching Ballen for a while now, and I'm starting to expect the goddamn plot twist. Why I feel like the police got something to do with it. Or like the...
normal, and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car. But because of the presence of that lieutenant, who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation. But Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she's been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area,
he got a whole scene
looking for a shell casing. Any clue in the vicinity, but they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far. But he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet. But remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people.
Yep.
I mean, someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people looking for any.
You know how many sliding that? You know how much sliding they had to do? Scoured. That nigga did. I'm sorry, I can't say that anywhere because of YouTube. But this man right here really understands the assignment.
Who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself, they must have missed something. They've talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we're gonna go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with the shooting. And we're gonna ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working and he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy McEwen. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there's that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, "Are you here about Nancy?" And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there too, he still said he didn't hear or it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways, so, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow.
Yeah.
The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning, what'd you see, were there other fishermen out there, when you were at the gas, see anything unusual, just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could, and at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing, and suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road and crashed, Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can and he kept staring at it, then he fired a shot. But he missed. The bullet by some ricocheted off the surface of the water
and hit Nancy.
Went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible. A ricochet in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him,
What?
citing that this truly was an accident.
Nah, screw that, man. Kill my freaking daughter. Screw that. No.
Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined.
No.
Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits.
That's no, bro. No. You have to see me.
Hey guys, did you know you can get your strange, dark, and mysterious fix anytime, anywhere with the Mr. Ballen podcast on Amazon Music? Well, you can. There are tons of stories waiting to be binged right now, plus there are exclusive stories on there that have never been shared on this YouTube channel. Amazon Music listeners get to listen to new episodes an entire month before everybody else. You can also listen to my other show, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, 2 weeks early and totally ad-free on Amazon Music. If you're already a Prime member, well, you already have access to those 2 shows, plus hundreds of other top podcasts ad-free, all at no extra cost. That's right, your Prime membership includes Amazon Music absolutely free. So if you're ready to dive deeper into strange, dark, and mysterious stories, well, go download the Amazon Music app today and listen to the Mr. Ballen podcast and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. Now, back to today's stories.
That's crazy.
On the evening of September 17th, 2021, a 42-year-old preacher named Jason Thornburg was cleaning up his motel room in Eunice, Texas, which is a small city between Dallas and Fort Worth. Jason was going to be hosting a small Bible study group in his motel room in a few minutes, and even though really it was not that dirty, he was really taking time to ensure it was as clean and inviting as he could possibly make it. So normally, Jason would host these Bible study groups at his house. But unfortunately, Jason's house burned down just that past summer, and he lost everything. But Jason was so committed to God and spreading the word of God that he still wanted to continue having these Bible study groups, even if it meant, doing it in this kind of crummy motel room. And so Jason walked around the room, picking up laundry and straightening up his bed. And then after kind of arranging chairs in a circle for the various participants he was expecting, he went over to a cabinet, pulled out some Bibles, and right as he was about to start placing these Bibles on each chair, he heard a knock at the door. And Jason was really excited because he knew that had to be someone who was here for this Bible study. And so he walked right over, Bibles in hand, to the door. He opened it up, and standing outside the door was this big guy covered in tattoos, kind of looking down at Jason. And Jason broke into a big smile. He was so happy to see this guy. The man's name was David Luaris, and Jason had previously met him when he was out on the street doing outreach for his church, and he had invited David to, anytime he wanted, to come by the motel and be a part of this Bible study group. Now, Jason knew that David was really not the kind of guy who went to church or really showed any real interest in God or, the Bible, but, Jason took all kinds, and he was just hopeful that maybe David would show up someday.
Amen.
And now, here David was. However, David told Jason that the reason he was here was actually not for the Bible study group. He was here because he was in the middle of a crisis and he didn't know where else to turn. He confessed to Jason that he had begun using drugs and gotten mixed up in some criminal activity, and there's some dangerous people out there that he was sort of running with, and now his concern was some of those dangerous people were coming to get him. And so he literally felt like his life was in danger. Now, when Jason heard this, he was surprised. But at the same time, he could tell that David was being very authentic and just needed help. And Jason felt like, his job ultimately was to serve God and all of God's people. And David was one of those people, and he was in need of help. And so if all Jason did was simply provided safe haven for David inside of this motel room, then that was serving God, and it was the right thing to do. And so Jason immediately said, "No problem, David." He handed him a Bible and said, "Come on in." David took the Bible awkwardly and just kind of stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. But then Jason said, "Hey, relax, just come inside, take a seat." And so David did. He walked in, he sat down with the Bible, and then Jason actually came over and sat down next to him. And the two of them, for about 15 minutes, just made kind of awkward small talk. Jason could tell, David is completely on edge. He was staring at the door, which was now closed, and he just clearly was very anxious and paranoid. And so Jason really wasn't talking about the Bible or God or anything. He was just, trying to calm David down and show him that this was a safe place. And then after about 15 minutes of this, when David had somewhat calmed down, and also by this point, nobody else had showed up for this Bible study group, Jason decided, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll just begin the Bible study with David. It kind of gives us something to do. And so Jason got up, he locked the door, showing David that it's just going to be them, it's safe here. And he told David to go ahead and open his Bible to a certain page. And then the two of them just began reading the Bible together. And for hours, they just sat there reading the Bible, and Jason spoke to David about, teachings of God and how to lead your life in a way to serve other people. And, for the most part, David did completely calm down and seemed to really be embracing this Bible study. But eventually, despite how well this Bible study was going, it did need to come to an end at some point, at least in Jason's mind. And when he began to notice it was getting dark outside, he sort of began wrapping it up, and he shut his Bible and sort of expected that David would take a hint and leave, but David didn't. Instead, when David began to realize that, hey, this is over now and it's time for you to go, David looked at Jason and begged him to please let him stay in this room overnight, that he can't go out there, it's not safe for him. Now, Jason knew he did have some level of responsibility for David. I mean, David had told him he was in danger, he had already invited him inside and was basically providing safe haven for him, and it did feel kind of wrong to be like, now go back out there, but at the same time, Jason felt a little uneasy. I mean, he didn't really know David. He didn't really understand the situation. Yeah. And so there was some hesitation at first, but after looking again at David and seeing how desperate he was.
I would have asked him, okay, hold up, brother. At least run me by what in the world is you into?
Just please stay here overnight. Jason said, okay, you can stay. So Jason grabbed some extra blankets and pillows and created a makeshift bed on the floor. And then after that, the two of them actually reopened their Bibles and just began reading some more from the Bible for a couple more hours. Basically another round of Bible study. But eventually, they both were very tired, so they put their Bibles down, they said goodnight, they each climbed into their beds, and they closed their eyes and fell asleep. For the next 5 days, Jason's motel room remained mostly closed. And the only thing anybody heard coming from his room was gospel music. And it was being played at a very high volume, basically the entire time, to the point where other residents of this motel began to complain about how loud the music was. However, the owner of the motel was getting these complaints from residents who were only there for, hours at a time or days at a time. And, the room they're complaining about, Jason's room, he was a long-term resident and so had a sort of higher priority with the owner. And so the owner just didn't feel like bothering Jason. He wanted him to stay and keep paying for that room. And so the owner didn't do anything about the noise complaints.
Wow.
And also, the owner did know that his motel had sort of a seedy reputation, and so, generally speaking, he didn't really care too much about the music to begin with. And so over the course of these 5 days...
He didn't even give a goddamn. He ain't give a day. You imagine the freaking
The music kept on blasting, and really the only other thing of note, again, that happened in this period of time, was that these two other people entered Jason's motel room and didn't leave either. So basically there's 4 people in the room, they haven't come out again, super loud music.
What?
That's all going on for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, the morning of September 22nd, a single person walked out of Jason's motel room, and they were wearing a full-body hazmat suit.
Yep, they killed him.
And carrying some sort of luggage.
They killed him.
And they would leave the motel, get in a car, and drive away. 45 minutes later, about 25 miles away from that motel,
they killed him.
The Fort Worth Fire Department got a call about this raging dumpster fire in a residential neighborhood. Firefighters quickly got to the scene and put out the blaze, and after it was gone, they walked up to the smoky dumpster and looked inside just to get a look at what was burning, and what they saw caused them all to back up and call the police. It would turn out David was right when he said he was in danger. However, what he didn't understand is hiding out in Jason's motel room was not going to protect him from that danger. Shortly after he and Jason wrapped up that second Bible study that night, and the two of them climbed into their respective beds, Jason in his actual bed and David in the makeshift bed on the floor, well, David did fall asleep pretty quickly, but Jason didn't. Jason waited until David was asleep.
What?
And then Jason got up, got a knife, and then slit David's throat. Then
What?
he cut David's heart out and ate it.
Huh?
Because Jason the preacher really actually believed that human sacrifice was the best and purest way to serve God. Over the course of the next 5 days after killing David, Jason would remain in his motel room blasting gospel music, and over those 5 days, he would basically lure those 2 women into his room, very likely on the promise of Bible study, but they too would be sacrificed. And then on the 5th day, the person who exited the motel room in the full hazmat suit was Jason, and that luggage he was carrying with him contained the body parts of the 3 people he had just killed. And he brought those body parts to that dumpster in that residential neighborhood and lit them on fire. And so when the firefighters put out the fire, what they saw inside were burned up bodies. Jason was arrested, and while he was awaiting trial, he confessed that David and the 2 women were not actually his first victims. He said that just a few years earlier, he had sacrificed his girlfriend, and that house fire that destroyed all of his belongings and prompted him to go live in this motel was set by Jason himself. Because he had sacrificed his roommate and needed to get rid of the evidence. Ultimately, law enforcement was only able to show that Jason killed those 5 people. But there could have been more. Jason was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Texas.
Okay, so so what I thought happened was David, the danger. Just wow, I'm flabbergasted right now.
On the evening of Thursday, May 21st, 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Lily walked into the home gym inside of her house in Hong Kong looking to do a workout. Now, she sort of expected the gym would be empty and she could kind of have the run of the place, but as soon as she walked in, she saw her dad was in there and he was doing some sort of cool down exercise on a yoga ball. So Lily's dad, whose name was Ka Kim Sun, was a doctor and a professional, and normally at this time of the day, she would never see him in the gym. He was typically locked upstairs in his study, or upstairs doing work or something, or he was just gone for the day. So for him to be here, it just didn't really line up with his schedule. And so Lily asked her dad, what are you doing here? What's going on? And her dad would tell her, well, actually, work at the hospital was really slow today, so I took off, I played some tennis with friends, and now I'm just doing some cool down exercises because I got nothing else to do. But I'll be out of your hair in a second. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, her dad was up and out of the gym, and Lily just began her workout. The next day, May 22nd, around 1 o'clock, Lily was at home at her dining room table, sitting across from her mother, whose name was Wong Siu Fing, and Lily was eating a snack and staring at an open textbook. Now, normally at 1 o'clock on a Friday, Lily would be at school, but she had had the day off that day. And she had wanted to spend her day off seeing friends and just being a teenager, but her dad was really focused on her being successful academically, and he told her that absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. You are gonna stay home and you are gonna study all day long. You will not leave the house. That's what you're doing. So Lily just continued to stare at the textbook and basically do what her father said. And then a couple of minutes later, she actually heard her dad coming down the stairs, and he came into the dining room, and he was clearly very pleased to see his daughter doing her work, or at least appearing to do her work. And he came over to her, gave her a kiss, he kissed their mother, and then he said he was off to work. And then he went out the door, and he was gone. And as soon as Carl was gone, Lily's mom looked over at her and said, I'm not gonna make you study all day. Come on, let's go out and have a mother-daughter shopping day. And Lily was stoked. She shut her textbook, she went and got ready, and then a minute later, she and her mom climbed into her mom's yellow Mini Cooper car, and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15 p.m., a local jogger was running in the same neighborhood as where Lily and her family lived, and as they were running down the road, they noticed there was this yellow Mini Cooper car sitting on the side of the road, not moving, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the Cooper car, and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the car, but they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there, not moving. And so the jogger was curious, and so they ran past and made a point to look inside the car, and they saw 2 women in the front 2 seats of this car slumped over. The 2 women were Lily and her mother. And so the jogger began to panic and banged on the glass to try to get the women to respond, but they didn't. And so a minute later, police were called. They dragged Lily and her mother out of the car. They were totally unresponsive. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. They both died. The police would begin their investigation into their deaths by searching the yellow Mini Cooper car. And when they searched it, there really was nothing of note inside of it. I mean, the two women's purses were in the front of the car, there was some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, but the car was pristine, clean, not cluttered. I mean, there really was nothing in the car that gave away what could have happened to these two women. For the next 6 months, the police tirelessly looked for some lead as to what happened to this mother and daughter. They would interview all their friends and family. They would search their house top to bottom. They would basically take apart this Mini Cooper and look for, defects or flaws that maybe could have contributed to their death. I mean, they were looking everywhere, but it just didn't make sense. Nobody had any idea what happened to these two women. And so right as this case appeared like it was about to go cold, the detectives decided to just go back to the Mini Cooper and see if maybe, just maybe, they missed something. And sure enough, they had. It would turn out on May 22nd, 2015, the day that Lily and her mother died, Lily's father had told Lily to stay home and study, not because he cared about her academics. I mean, he did, but that day, the reason for this was not for that. Instead, he wanted her to stay home all day to protect her. When police originally searched Lily's mom's car, they found the two women's purses and also some basic exercise equipment in the trunk.
Yeah.
Specifically a deflated yoga ball. And at the time, the police didn't think anything of these items. They looked into them, they considered them, but they didn't seem to have any bearing on what happened to the women. However, it would turn out the yoga ball did have something to do with it.
Huh?
Specifically, 2 days before the women were found dead, that yoga ball was inside of Lily's home. It was in her home gym.
Yeah.
In fact, when she walked into the home gym and saw her dad doing cool down exercises and thought it was strange he was home right now, he was using that yoga ball. And Lily didn't think anything of it. But in reality, what her father was doing was not cool down exercises. He had not just come home early and, had played tennis and this and that. In reality, he had taken that yoga ball to the hospital where he worked and filled it with carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, poisonous gas. And his plan was to put the yoga ball in his wife's car, unplug it, and now it's sealed and the gas is gonna leak inside the car. And then when his wife got in the car and shut the door, she would effectively suffocate and die. He didn't try to kill his daughter though. He wanted her to stay home and study, i.e. don't go with your mom and get in the car. But the mother defied the father, brought the daughter along, and then after driving for only a mile, the two women collapsed and died. Ka Kim-sun was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He has never explained his motive.
Wow.
In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains...
Wow. So basically, Buddy